The Atlantic was raging that night. Huge waves, biting wind, and heavy rain transformed the sea into a relentless enemy. In the darkness, the wreckage of a British destroyer floated adrift. Among it, a nearly unconscious sailor struggled to keep his head above water. However, fate had other plans. A German captain, on his patrol boat, spotted the silhouette in the distance. The unlikely encounter would begin a story of survival, honor, and human dilemmas amidst war. The night was a relentless force, as if the Atlantic itself had turned against the men aboard the HMS Valor, a British destroyer on a routine patrol in 1942. The winter sea was cold beyond measure, the waves towering and black, rising like walls of liquid steel under the pale, flickering light of the ship's lanterns. Thomas Harding, a young seaman barely 19, felt the first tremors of panic as the vessel shuddered violently beneath him. The destroyer had been caught by a German U-boat in a sudden torpedo strike. Explosions rocked the ship, tearing through its steel hull, flinging men into the churning water below. The night was filled with the smell of burning fuel, the screams of comrades, and the deafening roar of the Atlantic. Thomas was thrown off his feet by the force of the blast, his body skidding across the slick deck. Around him, men shouted orders, some of them frozen with terror, others desperately clinging to rails and lifeboats. In the chaos, Thomas saw his best friend, Michael, struck down by debris. Swallowed almost instantly by the black waters, he had no time to grieve. The ship listed violently to starboard, and the freezing sea began to rush onto the deck. The metal groaned under the weight of water, and the smell of smoke mixed with salt filled his nostrils, a pungent reminder that death was already near. He scrambled to reach the lifeboats, his hands raw from the icy ropes, but they were already either torn from their moorings or unusable after the torpedo blast. Thomas found himself at the railing, staring into the abyss below. Every instinct screamed at him to hold on, but the destroyer was breaking apart. Pieces of the ship, the splintered wood, twisted metal, and floating crates were swept away as the waves crashed violently over the hull. He saw men clinging to life rings and wooden debris, their eyes wide with fear and disbelief, some shouting for their mothers, others praying silently. The sea was merciless, swallowing the weak and sparing only those who fought with all they had. The water hit Thomas like ice, instantly shocking him, numbing his limbs. The cold was unimaginable, a sharp, burning pain that stole the strength from his body. He kicked frantically, trying to keep his head above the foaming water, but exhaustion and hypothermia quickly took hold. Every stroke required more effort than his weakened body could muster. Around him, the sounds of destruction continued. The screams had begun to fade, replaced by the unending roar of the ocean and the creaking of the doomed ship as it slowly sank into the depths. Thomas clung to a piece of debris, a broken section of the ship's railing, and tried to regulate his breathing. He counted heartbeats to stay conscious, listening to the waves, searching desperately for signs of rescue. Hours seemed to pass like centuries. The cold crept deeper, turning his limbs numb and his thoughts sluggish. He thought about home, about his mother, and about the letters he would never send. Every moment was a battle against the rising tide of despair and the physical toll of the frigid Atlantic. As dawn approached, the storm that had engulfed the night began to waver, though the sea remained hostile. Thomas, barely clinging to life, spotted a shadow in the distance, a silhouette moving with precision against the chaotic waves. His mind struggled to comprehend whether it was a hallucination born from hypothermia or a real vessel. As the shadow grew closer, the outline of a German patrol ship became evident. Thomas's survival instincts surged, overriding exhaustion and fear. He screamed for help, but his voice was weak, carried away by the wind. He waved his arms, desperate for any sign that someone would see him, that he would not become just another victim claimed by the Atlantic. The German captain, Friedrich Weber, stood on the deck of his vessel, scanning the waters with trained eyes honed over years of naval warfare. Spotting a figure clinging to debris, his initial reaction was surprise. The sea had already taken countless men from both sides of the conflict. Another life in peril was not uncommon. Yet something about the young British sailor, the desperation, the raw fight to survive, struck a chord. Friedrich gave orders for the rescue. aware that pulling an enemy from the water would be controversial among his officers. But his conscience allowed no hesitation. As Thomas was hauled aboard, his body shivering violently, the German crew wrapped him in blankets and poured hot tea down his throat. Every breath he took burned his lungs, yet he was alive. The relief was overwhelming, but it was tempered by guilt and grief for the friends he had lost. He closed his eyes, feeling the warmth for the first time in what felt like an eternity, and whispered a silent vow. He would survive, he would remember, and he would never take life for granted again. The Atlantic had tried to claim him, but through chance, courage, and the unexpected humanity of a man considered his enemy, Thomas Harding had been saved. The wreck of the HMS Valor remained behind, a silent monument to the chaos of war. Thomas's ordeal had only begun, for in the coming days, he would face questions of loyalty, morality, and the fragile bonds that could form even in the most unlikely circumstances. The Atlantic had tested him, and though his body was battered, his spirit refused to yield. He had survived the impossible, and his story would become one of courage, resilience, and the unforeseen acts of mercy that war sometimes, paradoxically, reveals. Captain Friedrich Weber stood rigid on the deck of his patrol ship, the Atlantic wind biting through his uniform as he watched the rescued sailor shiver violently on the blankets the crew had draped over him. The young man, Thomas Harding, barely alive an hour ago, was now slowly regaining consciousness, his lips trembling and his eyes fluttering open against the harsh sunlight that reflected off the cold, grey sea. Friedrich, a seasoned naval officer, had seen countless lives lost in the chaos of war. Yet there was a gravity in rescuing an enemy that weighed heavily on him. The protocols of the Kriegsmarine left little room for mercy, but Friedrich's conscience refused to follow orders blindly. He had joined the German Navy as a cadet at the age of 16, drawn by a combination of national pride and the lure of the sea. Over the years, he had become a master navigator and a decisive tactician, commanding respect from his officers and crews alike. Friedrich knew the brutality of the Atlantic, a theatre of war where winter storms were as deadly as any torpedo. He had watched convoys sink beneath the waves, ships that carried hundreds of men swallowed in minutes, the cold water ensuring that very few ever saw rescue. The memory of these events lingered with him, shaping the decisions he now faced as he considered the British sailor before him. His crew was tense. Many of them whispered among themselves, uneasy about the implications of harboring an enemy soldier. In the eyes of some officers, rescuing a British seaman could be seen as a breach of military discipline, even treasonous. Yet Friedrich maintained a calm authority, his gaze fixed on Thomas as he issued quiet, deliberate commands. "Keep him warm, give him tea, check his pulse every 5 minutes," he instructed. The men obeyed, though their unease was evident. They respected Friedrich, but they could not ignore the potential danger. One slip could bring suspicion, and the rules of war were unyielding. Thomas, meanwhile, was slowly becoming aware of his surroundings. The first thing he noticed was the organized chaos of the German ship. Men moved efficiently across the deck, their faces focused, expressions hardened by months of wartime patrol. He observed their uniforms, the meticulous discipline, and the way every action was calculated. The realization that he was in enemy hands made his heart race. But fear was tempered by the immediate relief of having survived the Atlantic. His body was numb from cold and exhaustion, but he instinctively sensed that for the moment, he was safe. Friedrich approached him cautiously, careful not to startle the young man. "You are alive," he said in English, his accent heavy but clear. "You were lucky. The sea takes few who are unprepared." Thomas blinked, too weak to speak immediately, and finally whispered, "Thank you. I thought I would die." Friedrich nodded, understanding more than the words could express. The Atlantic was unforgiving. Survival required both luck and determination, and Thomas had displayed both. The captain considered the larger implications of his actions. Reports of the attack on the HMS Valor had not yet reached German intelligence, but Friedrich knew that a missing British sailor could complicate matters. If the Royal Navy discovered that their man had been rescued by enemy hands, questions would follow. Yet Friedrich weighed these concerns against the basic truth. A life had been saved, and morality in war, though often overshadowed by orders, still mattered. He had seen too many young men perish needlessly, their potential lost to icy waters, and he could not bring himself to turn away. The hours passed slowly. Friedrich moved across the deck, checking instruments and overseeing the crew, but his attention frequently returned to Thomas. The young sailor's breathing was shallow, but steady, and his color was gradually returning as the blankets and tea worked their effects. Friedrich allowed himself a moment to reflect on the thin line that separated life from death at sea. One misstep, one wave, one missed warning, and Thomas would have been lost forever. The responsibility weighed heavily on him, a burden Friedrich had learned to carry throughout years of command. Friedrich also considered the nature of war. He had faced enemies countless times, engaged in battles where death was the only certainty. Yet the sight of Thomas struggling for life, and the knowledge that his crew could save him, reminded Friedrich that humanity existed even in conflict. The lines between friend and foe blurred in such moments, reduced to the simple reality of survival. In the cold light of the Atlantic dawn, Friedrich recognized a truth often overlooked in strategy and orders. The preservation of life transcended allegiances. By nightfall, Thomas had regained enough strength to sit upright, though he remained wrapped in layers of blankets. Friedrich observed him from a distance, noting the resilience in the young sailor's eyes, the same determination that had kept him afloat through hours of freezing waves. For the first time since the attack, Friedrich allowed himself a small measure of hope. The storm had been survived, the sea had spared one life, and amidst the chaos of war, there existed a fragile possibility for understanding, even between enemies. As the German ship continued its patrol across the open Atlantic, Friedrich made a silent vow to himself. He would ensure that Thomas was cared for, that the young man had a chance to survive beyond this immediate rescue. War demanded duty and obedience. But in moments like these, it also required courage of a different kind, the courage to act according to conscience. Thomas's life depended on it, and Friedrich, seasoned by the unforgiving sea, understood that the choices made in these hours would define both men for the rest of the war. The Atlantic remained vast and perilous, waves crashing against the hull as the night deepened, but within the discipline of the German crew and the watchful eye of their captain, a small corner of humanity had endured. Thomas Harding, once lost to the depths, was alive, and Captain Friedrich Weber had made a choice that would echo far beyond the icy waters and steel of the battlefield. The Atlantic remained a cold, relentless force as the German patrol ship cut through the churning waves. Thomas Harding, wrapped in blankets and still shivering violently, was carefully guided across the deck by two sailors. His body, numb from hours in the freezing water, responded sluggishly, and every movement sent sharp pains through his limbs. Despite the comfort of the ship and the warmth of the blankets, he felt the lingering weight of the sea upon him, a memory of the hours he had spent clinging to debris in the dark, icy waters. Every breath was still shallow, his chest tight from the trauma of near drowning, yet there was a faint spark of life that refused to be extinguished. Captain Friedrich Weber observed the crew's careful handling of Thomas. Rescuing a man from the Atlantic was not a simple matter of lifting him aboard. It required coordination, awareness of the ship's stability, and rapid action in case the waves grew violent. A misstep could result in another casualty, either from falling overboard or from the already weakened sailor succumbing to the cold. The ship's deck was slippery with seawater, and the wind threatened to knock anyone off balance. Friedrich's training and years of experience guided every command he issued. "Steady him! Use the harness. Keep the blankets tight. Monitor his breathing," he said, voice firm yet calm. The crew moved efficiently, following his instructions without hesitation. Thomas's mind struggled to process what had happened. One moment, he had been surrounded by darkness, waves crashing over him, and the next he was on solid ground, protected from the storm. The contrast was jarring, and he found it difficult to trust the reality of his survival. His thoughts flickered to his crewmates on the HMS Valor, many of whom had been swallowed by the sea, and guilt gnawed at him. He had survived when others had not, and the realization brought a wave of emotion that made him tremble even more violently. The blankets were not enough to protect him from the mental weight of loss. Friedrich approached once more, observing Thomas carefully. "You have survived a night, most do not," he said quietly. "The Atlantic does not forgive mistakes, but you were strong. You fought with what little energy remained. That strength kept you alive." Thomas managed a weak nod, unable to speak more than a hoarse whisper. His body ached from the cold, and his lungs still burned from inhaling salt water. Every inch of him reminded him of the fragility of life, yet he felt a growing sense of gratitude toward the man who had ordered his rescue. The crew continued their work with methodical precision. One sailor checked Thomas's pulse, noting the slow but steady rhythm. Another monitored the thermometers, ensuring that he did not succumb to hypothermia in the still chilly conditions. The ship had supplies for emergency care, including hot tea, blankets, and basic medical instruments. But the experience of the Atlantic had left Thomas dangerously weak. Each action taken by the crew reflected lessons learned from years of naval operations. Knowledge that the sea could take life quickly, and that every precaution mattered. The rescue itself was perilous. The waves had not entirely calmed, and each movement on the deck required careful balance. Sailors secured Thomas with harnesses to prevent him from slipping into the water again. They had learned, through countless patrols and maritime disasters, that even a momentary lapse in attention could be fatal. Friedrich oversaw the operation closely, his eyes scanning the horizon as well as his crew. Survival at sea was as much about preparation and control as it was about courage, and Friedrich's command ensured that neither would be lacking. As Thomas slowly regained consciousness, he became aware of the faces around him, men who had just hours before been considered his enemy. The sight was disorienting, but the efficiency and calm of the German sailors instilled a sense of trust. He realized that, at this moment, the distinctions of nationality and war had faded. The focus was singular, keeping him alive. It was a revelation, one that challenged the rigid perceptions of friend and foe that war had instilled in him. He had been rescued not for political or military reasons, but because human life mattered, even to those who were officially enemies. By evening, the immediate danger had passed. Thomas was seated in the ship's infirmary, wrapped in additional blankets and sipping slowly on hot broth. His hands, still shaking from exposure, were finally warming. The pain in his muscles from the cold and the constant struggle to stay afloat was intense, but manageable under careful supervision. Friedrich visited him periodically, ensuring that he was stable, offering quiet reassurance without pressing for answers. It was clear to the captain that Thomas's recovery would be slow, but the fact that he had survived the initial night in the Atlantic was nothing short of remarkable. Friedrich reflected on the operation with a mixture of relief and contemplation. Rescuing a sailor from enemy forces was not an act without risk. It could have had consequences from higher command or sparked political complications. Yet as he watched Thomas gradually regain strength, Friedrich understood that the choice was necessary and just. In the harsh realities of war, moments of humanity were rare, but they were also essential. A life saved at sea could carry profound meaning, not only for the survivor, but also for those who had taken part in the rescue. The ship continued its patrol, the waves gradually lessening as night approached. But the lessons of the day were indelibly marked in Friedrich's mind. Thomas Harding had been plucked from the brink of death by a crew trained to follow orders, but guided by the judgment of a captain who recognized the value of human life. The Atlantic, vast and unyielding, had been challenged, and a single life had been preserved. Friedrich understood that this event, though seemingly small in the scope of the war, was a testament to the courage, skill, and moral resolve required of every man who faced the sea in times of conflict. The following morning, the German patrol ship moved steadily through the Atlantic, the waves still rolling, but no longer as violent as the night before. Thomas Harding, though still weak and pale, was seated in the infirmary beneath the dim light of the ship's lanterns. He could hear the creaking of the vessel, the constant hum of the engines, and the footsteps of sailors moving along the corridors above. Every sound reminded him that he was far from home, surrounded by men who had been trained to view him as an enemy, yet who had saved his life. It was a strange and uneasy realization. Captain Friedrich Weber walked the deck, his gaze alternating between the horizon and the activity of his crew. The atmosphere on the ship was tense. Though the immediate danger of the storm and the rescue had passed, the presence of a British sailor on board created unease among some officers. Whispers circulated in hushed tones about the potential consequences of sheltering an enemy combatant. One officer, Lieutenant Kruger, voiced his concerns to Friedrich, his tone a mixture of worry and frustration. "Captain, this is not our duty. He is the enemy. We risk our positions by keeping him alive," he said, glancing nervously at the infirmary door. Friedrich remained calm, his face impassive, but his mind weighed heavily on the issue. He had been through countless naval engagements, where orders had been clear and the line between life and death was dictated by military necessity. Yet in this case, a man's life hung in the balance, and no tactical advantage was gained by abandoning him. "Lieutenant," Friedrich replied evenly, "we are at sea. Survival depends not only on strength but on judgment. This man was at death's door. Our duty, in this moment, is to preserve life when possible. You may not like it, but we act as men, not as instruments of war." The officer's expression hardened, but he did not argue further. Friedrich's words carried authority, shaped by decades of experience and respect earned from his crew. The tension, however, was not limited to officers alone. Sailors whispered among themselves, some questioning the wisdom of risking supplies and safety for a survivor from an enemy vessel. Yet the crew followed orders without hesitation, performing their duties with precision as they had been trained, though unease lingered like a low fog across the ship. Meanwhile, Thomas struggled to regain strength. The initial shock of the Atlantic, combined with exposure to near-freezing water, had left him weak and disoriented. His limbs ached, and every step felt labored. Despite this, he attempted to adjust to his new surroundings, observing the disciplined routines of the German sailors. They moved efficiently, adjusting sails, checking instruments, and maintaining weapons, all while navigating through the uncertain waters of wartime patrols. Thomas realized that, although they were his enemies, their training and focus mirrored that of his own navy. It was a sobering reminder of the universality of discipline at sea. Friedrich observed Thomas quietly, noting the young sailor's attempts to process the situation. He understood that fear and confusion were natural reactions. The sea had already tested Thomas's endurance and courage, but now he faced a different challenge, navigating the uncertainty of being a prisoner and a guest at the same time. Friedrich allowed him small freedoms, encouraging movement within the infirmary and providing nourishment, understanding that regaining physical strength was critical not only for survival, but for maintaining morale. Throughout the day, the captain maintained a careful balance between authority and empathy. He oversaw the crew, ensured the ship's course and readiness, and periodically checked on Thomas. The sailor's recovery was slow but steady. Each sip of tea and bite of bread helped restore some energy, and the warmth of the blankets eased the relentless chill of the Atlantic. Friedrich knew that patience was essential. A single mistake, whether in judgment or treatment, could undo hours of care, and he was determined that the young man would survive this chapter of the war. As evening approached, the tension aboard the ship remained palpable. The crew had completed drills, maintained equipment, and secured the vessel against the unpredictable Atlantic. But conversations occasionally returned to Thomas. Some questioned the morality of harboring an enemy, while others quietly admired the captain's courage and the principle behind his decision. The dichotomy reflected the complexity of naval life during wartime. Orders demanded obedience, but personal judgment often guided action in the face of immediate danger. Friedrich considered the broader implications of their situation. Intelligence reports had not yet arrived regarding the HMS Valor, but he knew that the British would search for survivors. The presence of Thomas could complicate matters if intercepted. Yet beyond the strategic calculations, Friedrich's focus remained on the immediate reality. A life saved in a hostile environment, a fragile human connection amidst the vast and indifferent Atlantic. The sea had demanded courage, and human resolve had met it. That night, Thomas lay in the infirmary, wrapped in layers, watching the shadows of the ship as it cut through the dark waters. He reflected on the paradox of the situation. An enemy captain and crew had saved him, demonstrating a measure of humanity he had not expected. The fear of retribution or suspicion lingered, but it was overshadowed by the simple fact of survival. As he drifted into an uneasy sleep, the sounds of the Atlantic and the ship's steady engines reminded him that life, even in war, could be preserved with careful judgment, skill, and unexpected compassion. Captain Friedrich, standing on the deck under the cold stars, surveyed the horizon. The Atlantic stretched endlessly, indifferent to nations or conflicts. Within that vast expanse, he had made a choice that defied orders and protocol, yet upheld the fundamental value of life. The tension on the ship had not disappeared, but the principles guiding the captain and his crew were clear. In the midst of war, survival depended on discipline, courage, and, at times, the rare act of mercy that transcended allegiance. Thomas Harding's recovery had progressed slowly, yet each day brought new awareness of the circumstances he now faced. Sitting in the infirmary, wrapped in blankets and sipping weak broth, he could hear the constant hum of the engines and the rhythmic creaking of the German patrol ship as it cut through the waves. Every sound reminded him of the relentless power of the Atlantic, a force that had almost claimed his life only days before. The memory of floating among the debris of the HMS Valor, surrounded by darkness and the cries of drowning men, was vivid and unrelenting. Yet now, alive, he faced another challenge: understanding the men who had saved him. Captain Friedrich Weber had maintained a careful balance between authority and observation. He allowed Thomas small freedoms within the infirmary and occasionally escorted him onto the deck, where the cold wind whipped against both men. These walks were quiet at first, filled only with the sound of the sea and the groan of the ship beneath their feet. Slowly, Friedrich began to speak of the war, not to boast of victories or recount tactical maneuvers, but to share the human cost that each engagement demanded. He described patrols through the Atlantic, where torpedoes from submarines could strike without warning, where storm and enemy fire alike threatened the lives of young men who, like Thomas, had no choice but to fight and survive. Thomas listened with a mixture of awe and apprehension. He had experienced the fury of the ocean and the terror of a sinking ship, yet hearing the perspective of an officer from the opposing side added depth to his understanding of the war. Friedrich spoke of men lost to storms, convoys destroyed by submarines, and the weight of command that rested on the shoulders of those who directed naval operations. Every decision carried consequences, often life or death, and the captain's tone reflected both the burden and the inevitability of these choices. For Thomas, the conversation was both enlightening and humbling. He shared, in turn, fragments of his own experiences aboard the HMS Valor. He spoke of his first deployment, the rigorous training, the camaraderie among the crew, and the sudden chaos when the torpedo struck, memories of friends lost, faces forever etched in his mind, and the sound of the sea swallowing the destroyer created a vivid contrast to the structured routines of the German ship. Yet even in recounting these experiences, Thomas realized that courage, fear, and determination were universal. Both sides endured the same storms, faced the same dangers, and fought with the same desperate hope for survival. The exchange between Thomas and Friedrich gradually deepened into discussions of individual stories, moments that went beyond the mechanics of war. Friedrich spoke of sailors he had trained, friends he had lost to mines and storms, and the unspoken toll of witnessing deaths that could not be prevented. Thomas responded with stories of his own family, the letters he had written before deployment, and the bond shared with his comrades. The conversation bridged a gap that the ocean and wartime divisions had created, revealing a shared humanity amidst the brutality of conflict. Throughout these discussions, the patrol ship continued its duties with disciplined precision. Sailors maintained equipment, monitored instruments, and prepared for potential encounters with enemy vessels. Thomas observed closely, noting the efficiency, the focus, and the silent tension that permeated every action. He began to appreciate the challenges Friedrich faced as a captain, balancing the survival of the crew, the demands of the mission, and the moral questions that arose when life and duty intersected. The Atlantic was unforgiving, and every choice carried risk. Yet the captain's steady hand ensured that the ship remained secure, and that Thomas survived another day. By the fourth day, Thomas was strong enough to assist with minor tasks aboard the ship. He carried messages, observed navigational procedures, and participated in basic maintenance under supervision. Each small responsibility reinforced his sense of purpose and gradually restored his confidence. The captain continued to guide him, not with orders, but with quiet mentorship, offering advice and insights drawn from years of experience. Through these interactions, Thomas learned that survival at sea was not only a matter of strength, but of awareness, adaptability, and cooperation. The bond between the two men grew subtly but steadily. Friedrich respected Thomas's resilience, noting the young sailor's determination to recover despite exhaustion and trauma. Thomas, in turn, recognized the humanity and discipline that guided the captain's decisions. Amid the indifferent expanse of the Atlantic, these moments of trust and understanding became a fragile anchor in the midst of war. Both men understood that while the ocean could destroy, it could also inspire a recognition of shared experience, a lesson in the universality of courage and endurance. As night fell, the Atlantic stretched endlessly around them, dark and unyielding. Thomas lay in the infirmary, reflecting on the conversations he had shared with Friedrich, the stories of comrades, and the stark realities of naval warfare. Despite being an enemy, the captain had saved him, and through their exchanges, Thomas began to see beyond the rigid boundaries of nationality. The sea had tested him, the storm had challenged him, and the ship had carried him through the aftermath. Yet it was these moments of shared humanity that left the deepest impression, a reminder that even amidst conflict, empathy, courage, and understanding could survive. Captain Friedrich, standing on the deck under the cold stars, surveyed the dark horizon. The Atlantic remained vast, unpredictable, and indifferent to nations or battles. Yet amidst its relentless waves, a single act of mercy had endured. In guiding Thomas through recovery and sharing the human cost of war, Friedrich demonstrated that leadership required more than strategy. It demanded moral courage. The night was quiet, save for the gentle groan of the hull and the distant crash of waves. But within the ship, lives were being shaped not only by conflict, but by the recognition of shared humanity, a lesson forged in the heart of the Atlantic. The Atlantic showed no mercy that day. Clouds gathered quickly on the horizon, dark and heavy, their shadows stretching across the restless sea. The German patrol ship moved cautiously through the waters, but the wind had begun to rise, howling across the deck with a force that threatened to sweep away anything not firmly secured. Sailors scrambled to tighten rigging, lash equipment, and ensure that all hatches were closed. Even experienced men felt the tension of the moment, aware that the ocean could turn deadly in seconds. Thomas Harding, now somewhat recovered but still weak from his ordeal, was brought to the deck under the watchful eye of Captain Friedrich Weber. The cold wind bit through his clothing, and he struggled to maintain balance as the ship pitched violently with each wave. The sea had grown from a rolling expanse into a wall of water, waves crashing over the bow and washing across the deck in sheets of icy spray. Thomas gripped the railing with both hands, muscles taut, feeling the raw power of the Atlantic as it tossed the ship like a toy. Friedrich moved along the deck with measured steps, issuing commands in clipped German, his voice cutting through the roar of the wind and waves. "Secure the aft guns! Brace all equipment! Maintain course!" Each order was executed with precision. Sailors moved quickly, tying ropes and adjusting ballast to stabilize the ship. Friedrich knew that even the slightest miscalculation could have catastrophic consequences. A destroyer, though smaller than larger battleships, could be easily compromised by waves of this magnitude, and a misstep could send men or equipment overboard in an instant. Thomas observed the disciplined chaos, noting how each sailor knew his role, how training dictated action even under extreme conditions. He realized that survival in the Atlantic depended not only on courage, but on procedure, skill, and trust in those around you. For all their experience, the crew remained vulnerable to the sheer unpredictability of the ocean. One wrong move, one poorly tied knot, and disaster could strike. The thought sent a shiver through Thomas, but he also felt a growing respect for the men who navigated this environment daily. The storm intensified as the afternoon progressed, Waves towered over the bow, breaking into foaming whitecaps that struck the hull with deafening force. Rain lashed against the deck, stinging faces and soaking uniforms. Visibility dropped to mere meters, and the horizon disappeared into a grey, undulating wall of water. Friedrich remained calm, issuing commands steadily, his eyes scanning the churning waters for hazards. He knew that maintaining the ship's heading was critical. Any deviation could result in broaching or capsizing. Every decision was calculated, every maneuver precise. And yet he was acutely aware that the Atlantic demanded respect and vigilance at all times. Thomas was assigned a position near the lifeboat area, under close supervision, helping with securing ropes and observing how the crew reacted to each wave. Despite his frailty, he felt a surge of purpose. Every action mattered, every second counted. He watched as Friedrich directed the crew, noting the captain's calm authority and the way he moved with confidence despite the violent swells. The young sailor began to understand that leadership at sea was not just about issuing orders. It was about presence, awareness, and an ability to remain composed under life-threatening stress. Hours passed with relentless intensity. The storm showed no sign of abating, and the ship continued to pitch and roll violently. At one point, a massive wave struck the deck, sweeping unsecured equipment across the surface and knocking a sailor off his feet. Another crew member lunged, catching him just in time. Thomas felt his heart race. The near disaster was a stark reminder that even trained sailors were vulnerable. Friedrich's commands were immediate and precise, stabilizing the situation, but the adrenaline in Thomas's veins reminded him that the Atlantic was unforgiving, and survival required constant vigilance. Amid the chaos, Thomas caught sight of Friedrich securing himself near the bridge, eyes scanning the horizon, body taut against the wind. The captain's presence inspired confidence in the crew, reinforcing the order and discipline needed to withstand the storm. Thomas realized that this man, an enemy only days ago, had not only saved his life, but was now leading the crew through one of the most dangerous conditions he had ever encountered. Respect mixed with gratitude, forming a complex understanding that transcended national allegiance. By nightfall, the storm showed signs of weakening, though the sea remained rough and the decks slick with water. Sailors continued to check equipment, ensuring no damage had compromised the ship's integrity. Thomas, exhausted but increasingly aware of his own resilience, helped where he could, carrying ropes and assisting with minor repairs under supervision. The sense of accomplishment was tempered by fatigue, but he felt a quiet pride in having endured the storm, learning firsthand the unforgiving nature of the Atlantic. Captain Friedrich finally allowed a moment of rest. He walked among the crew, acknowledging their efforts, and glanced at Thomas, who stood shivering but upright. "You survived," Friedrich said quietly, his voice carrying over the wind. "The Atlantic tests every man, but it rewards those who remain vigilant and disciplined. You are fortunate to be here." Thomas nodded, swallowing hard, feeling the weight of what had transpired. He had faced death twice now, first in the waters of the HMS Valor, then on the deck of the German ship amidst a violent storm, and had survived both, guided by courage, training, and unexpected compassion. As night settled over the Atlantic, the patrol ship pressed onward, waves still rolling but manageable. Thomas lay in the infirmary, muscles aching and heart pounding, yet a growing sense of respect for the crew and captain warmed him. The storm had tested skill, endurance, and leadership, and through it all he had witnessed firsthand the demands and realities of naval life during wartime. The Atlantic remained vast and indifferent, but on this ship, amidst disciplined sailors and a captain guided by both strategy and conscience, survival had endured. Thomas Harding had learned that courage, discipline, and trust were as vital as any weapon in the war, and that the sea, though merciless, could also reveal the character of those who sailed upon it. The storm had passed, leaving the Atlantic restless but calmer, yet its effects lingered in the muscles and minds of all aboard the German patrol ship. Thomas Harding, once barely clinging to life in the freezing waters of the HMS Valor, now moved with a tentative strength, still weak but gradually regaining the coordination stolen from him by hypothermia and exhaustion. Each step on the wet deck reminded him of the fragility of survival and the unpredictability of the sea. He was alive, because of skill, chance, and the unexpected compassion of men he had been trained to see as enemies. Captain Friedrich Weber observed him closely, noting every movement, every hesitation. For a soldier, recovery was not only physical, it was a mental process, an adjustment to new realities. Friedrich understood that Thomas carried the memory of the shipwreck, the screams of his comrades, and the raw terror of the Atlantic. To survive the storm, to endure the trauma, required more than strength. It demanded resilience, trust, and an acceptance of circumstance. The captain had witnessed countless sailors succumb to despair in the aftermath of maritime disaster. He resolved to ensure that this young man would not be among them. Over the following days, Thomas and Friedrich began to communicate more directly. Their conversations tentative at first, constrained by language barriers and mutual wariness. Friedrich spoke of naval operations, of patrol routines, and of the unforgiving nature of the Atlantic during wartime. He did not dwell on victories or national pride, but shared stories of human endurance. Men who had survived storms, who had faced near impossible odds, and who had learned to rely on discipline, experience, and one another. Thomas listened intently, drawing parallels with his own experiences, noting how fear and courage could coexist in moments of crisis. One afternoon, Friedrich invited Thomas onto the bridge under the pretext of explaining navigational procedures. The captain pointed to the compass, the chronometer, and the instruments used to track position and speed, detailing their purpose and the precision required for safe passage. Thomas marveled at the expertise, recognizing that the skill displayed was born of necessity and repeated exposure to danger. The ocean was impartial. Any miscalculation could have catastrophic consequences. In this moment, Thomas saw Friedrich not as an enemy, but as a man shaped by the same forces that had molded him and his fellow sailors: fear, duty, and the will to survive. Their conversations gradually shifted from the technical to the personal. Thomas shared memories of life aboard the HMS Valor before the attack. The camaraderie, the routines, the moments of levity that punctuated the endless patrols. Friedrich, in turn, spoke of men he had trained, the sacrifices of his crew, and the losses that had marked his own career. Through these exchanges, they discovered common ground. Both had experienced the relentless dangers of the Atlantic, the fragility of life at sea, and the weight of responsibility, albeit from different sides of the conflict. The recognition of shared humanity created a subtle but meaningful bond. Thomas began assisting with minor tasks on deck, still under close supervision, but increasingly trusted by the crew. His physical recovery, though not complete, allowed him to participate in routine duties, monitoring lines, assisting with equipment, and observing the ship's response to waves and wind. Each task was a lesson in discipline and coordination, and Friedrich used these opportunities to reinforce principles of naval survival. Thomas absorbed the instruction quickly, impressed by the efficiency and cohesion of the German crew, and by the calm authority of the captain guiding every decision. Despite the growing familiarity, tension occasionally surfaced. Sailors whispered about harboring a British survivor, and Thomas was acutely aware of his position. He was both a guest and a potential liability. Friedrich navigated these undercurrents with careful judgment, addressing concerns without alienating his crew. He demonstrated that leadership was not merely about enforcing orders, but about fostering trust, ensuring cohesion, and managing risk in a volatile environment. Thomas observed this closely, gaining insight into the burdens of command and the fine balance between authority and empathy. Evenings became moments of reflection for both men. As the ship sailed under the cold light of the stars, Thomas would watch Friedrich on deck, silent, scanning the horizon, and he recognized the weight of decisions the captain carried daily. He had saved him from the Atlantic, guided the crew through a storm, and now continued to maintain order, discipline, and moral clarity. Thomas understood that survival was not only the result of luck or training, but also of the courage to act rightly, even when the consequences were uncertain. Through shared experience, respect grew. Thomas saw Friedrich as a figure of steadfast resolve, a man capable of measured decisions under extreme stress, and of unexpected mercy when circumstances allowed. Friedrich, in turn, recognized Thomas's resilience, determination, and capacity to adapt under duress. The Atlantic had forged an unlikely bond between them, one that transcended national allegiance and reflected a fundamental human truth. In moments of survival, character and courage mattered more than flags or orders. By the end of the week, Thomas had regained enough strength to stand for extended periods on the deck without assistance, to perform basic tasks with competence, and to engage fully in conversations with Friedrich. The captain continued to mentor him, imparting knowledge and observing his growth, aware that the young sailor's future depended not only on physical recovery, but also on the lessons learned from shared hardship. In the vast, indifferent expanse of the Atlantic, amidst the chaos of war and the unpredictability of the sea, Thomas Harding and Friedrich Weber had discovered an unexpected reality. Humanity could endure even in the midst of conflict, and the bonds formed in survival could defy the divisions of war. The Atlantic stretched endlessly beneath a grey sky, waves rolling with relentless energy, as the German patrol ship maintained a cautious course. Captain Friedrich Weber stood on the bridge, eyes scanning the horizon, but his mind was preoccupied with intelligence reports that had arrived earlier in the day. Communications, intercepted from Kriegsmarine Command, indicated that Allied forces were actively searching for survivors of the HMS Valor. The news introduced a complex dilemma. Harbouring Thomas Harding, the British sailor they had rescued, placed the ship and crew at potential risk. The captain's decision to save him, morally clear, now collided with the strategic realities of war. Friedrich reviewed the reports carefully, noting the coordinates of Allied search patterns, the expected timing of reconnaissance aircraft, and the potential paths of naval vessels. The intelligence made it clear that the presence of a British survivor aboard a German ship could compromise their mission, attract unwanted attention, and even trigger accusations of negligence or mismanagement from higher command. He understood the stakes. Exposure could endanger the crew, disrupt patrol operations, and jeopardize his career. Yet abandoning Thomas to the Atlantic had never been an option, and now the captain had to navigate the precarious line between morality and military necessity. Thomas, unaware of the full scope of the intelligence reports, spent the day performing minor duties on deck, gradually regaining strength. He observed the disciplined efficiency of the crew, the meticulous monitoring of instruments, and the tension that seemed to hang invisibly in the air. Though still recovering, he sensed that something had changed in the captain's demeanor. Friedrich was quieter, more deliberate in his movements, and increasingly focused on communications and the strategic positioning of the ship. Thomas did not yet understand the implications, but he noticed the subtle weight of responsibility pressing on Friedrich's shoulders. By evening, Friedrich requested Thomas to join him on the bridge. The captain explained, in careful English, the nature of the intelligence reports. "They are searching for survivors," he said, voice low but firm. "Your presence on this ship could reveal our position. We must be cautious. You understand the risk?" Thomas nodded, processing the gravity of the situation. He realized that survival was no longer simply a matter of recovering from exposure or navigating storms. Now his very existence aboard the ship had become a strategic liability, one that could endanger everyone. The captain outlined a plan, emphasizing both discretion and readiness. Thomas would remain largely confined to certain areas, avoiding the main deck during times of potential observation from the air. He would perform tasks that contributed to the ship's operation without drawing attention. Learning quickly the balance between usefulness and visibility, Friedrich's instructions were precise. Maintain discipline, observe silently, and act only when necessary. The young sailor understood immediately that the survival lessons of the Atlantic now extended to concealment and strategy, where missteps could have fatal consequences. As night fell, Friedrich convened the senior officers to discuss the situation. He framed it carefully, emphasizing both the risks and the ethical considerations. The officers were divided. Some voiced concern about harboring an enemy combatant, citing potential repercussions and the danger of exposure. Others recognized the moral imperative of having saved a life and deferred to the captain's judgment. Friedrich maintained authority, acknowledging the complexity but asserting that discipline, caution, and preparedness would mitigate risk. He reminded the crew that the Atlantic offered no second chances. Vigilance was their only protection. Meanwhile, Thomas reflected on the irony of his situation. He had survived the sinking of the HMS Valor, endured the merciless Atlantic, and been rescued by men sworn to be his enemies. Now, the same ship that had saved him demanded careful strategy and discretion to avoid detection. He felt a mix of gratitude, apprehension, and determination. Survival was no longer only physical, it was tactical, requiring awareness of the movements of others, the judgments of command, and the unyielding reality of wartime operations. Throughout the night, the ship maintained a heightened alert. Watchmen scanned the horizon, sonar and radar operators monitored for distant vessels, and the crew moved with deliberate precision. Friedrich remained on the bridge, continuously evaluating reports, adjusting course, and considering contingencies. His focus on Thomas's safety was unwavering, blending strategic foresight with a commitment to preserve life. The tension was palpable, but the captain's steady presence reassured the crew that their training and discipline could withstand both environmental and operational threats. In the dim light of the bridge, Thomas observed Friedrich's concentration and realized the depth of responsibility carried by a captain. Leadership at sea required not only knowledge of navigation, warfare, and survival, but also ethical judgment in moments when rules and orders collided with conscience. Friedrich's decision to save him had already demonstrated moral courage, and now it was being tested against the rigid demands of military strategy. Thomas understood that his life, while rescued, was inseparable from the fate of the ship and crew, and that every action taken from this point forward required caution, respect, and adherence to discipline. By morning, the Atlantic calmed slightly, but the tension aboard the ship remained. The captain continued to monitor reports, adjust patrol patterns, and instruct Thomas in subtlety and vigilance. The young sailor absorbed each lesson, aware that survival depended equally on discretion, cooperation, and mutual trust. In the vast expanse of ocean, where the next wave or signal could alter their fate, the bond between rescuer and rescued deepened, forged through shared experience, mutual reliance, and the constant negotiation between duty and humanity. The Atlantic stretched endlessly under a slate-grey sky, waves rolling with an unrelenting rhythm that echoed the tension aboard the German patrol ship. Captain Friedrich Weber stood on the bridge, eyes fixed on the horizon, his posture rigid but measured. The intelligence reports of Allied search operations had proven accurate. Radar had detected the distant outline of an enemy reconnaissance vessel moving parallel to their course. Every man on board recognized the danger. The presence of Thomas Harding, the British sailor they had rescued, made the situation exponentially more critical. One misstep could expose them, endanger the crew, and compromise their mission. Thomas, positioned under close supervision near the aft deck, could feel the tension in the air. Though his recovery had allowed him to participate in basic duties, he remained acutely aware of the precariousness of his position. The knowledge that enemy eyes could be scanning for survivors forced a constant awareness of his movements, his posture, and even the areas of the ship he occupied. He realized that survival now relied not only on physical resilience, but on discretion, obedience, and the trust he had built with Friedrich. Every action mattered, every glance could have consequences. Friedrich issued precise instructions to the crew, ensuring that all equipment was secured, lookouts were positioned, and radio transmissions were minimized. The captain's decisions were calculated, reflecting decades of naval experience and the need to balance operational security with ethical responsibility. "Maintain course, adjust speed slightly," he commanded, his voice carrying over the wind. "Keep all lights off. Watch the horizon continuously. Every man knows his duty." The crew responded with efficiency, their movements a blend of practiced skill and heightened alertness. Thomas observed closely, learning not only procedures but the psychology of command under extreme conditions. As the reconnaissance vessel drew nearer, tension escalated. Friedrich had ordered Thomas to remain within the confined areas of the aft deck, limiting exposure to potential detection. The captain's presence was constant, ensuring that the young sailor's actions did not compromise their position. Thomas could see the radar operator monitoring the distance and speed of the approaching vessel, each update sharpening the sense of urgency. Every wave that splashed over the deck, every gust of wind, seemed to amplify the stakes. Survival depended on focus, coordination, and the careful execution of strategy. Hours passed with the enemy vessel moving steadily closer. Friedrich coordinated maneuvers with a precision born of experience, adjusting course and speed in response to changes in the enemy's trajectory. The Atlantic, though vast, left little margin for error. A single miscalculation could result in detection, a forced engagement, or a collision. The crew's discipline, their adherence to orders, and their trust in the captain were tested to the limit. Thomas, though a recent addition, observed and participated where possible, understanding that the lessons of survival extended beyond immediate rescue to the navigation of life-and-death scenarios under pressure. Throughout the day, Friedrich maintained communication with his officers in subdued tones, analyzing the risks, predicting the enemy's likely actions, and preparing contingencies. The captain's demeanor was calm, but his mind worked relentlessly, calculating probabilities, potential outcomes, and the best course to preserve both his crew and Thomas. The ethical tension weighed on him as well. He had chosen to save a life, yet that decision now carried potential consequences that could threaten the safety of many. The balance between morality and strategy had never been more delicate. By late afternoon, the enemy vessel was within visual range. Sailors strained their eyes against the glare of the sun reflecting off the waves, the outline of a British reconnaissance ship becoming increasingly distinct. Thomas, hidden behind the aft structures, felt his pulse quicken. Every instinct from his naval training surfaced, the recognition of ship types, the anticipation of maneuvers, and the analysis of probable enemy intent. Yet now, he also relied on the judgment of Friedrich, whose steady guidance had ensured his survival through storms, shipwreck, and the isolation of the Atlantic. Friedrich executed a careful series of maneuvers, keeping the German ship partially concealed in the swell of the waves, avoiding direct lines of sight, and minimizing wake that could betray their position. He communicated silently with lookouts and officers, adjusting course with precise timing, his eyes never leaving the enemy vessel. The tension was immense. One misjudgment, one exposed sailor, one light or sound out of place could result in disaster. Thomas, witnessing the captain's skill and composure, understood the depth of responsibility and the weight of command. As the reconnaissance ship passed at a safe distance, Friedrich allowed a cautious exhalation. The immediate danger had passed, but the implications of the encounter remained. The captain reinforced instructions regarding vigilance, discipline, and concealment. Thomas reflected on the close call, recognizing that survival was not only about weathering storms or recovering from injuries, but also navigating the unpredictable dangers posed by human adversaries. The Atlantic had tested skill, courage, and resilience, but now it demanded strategy, discretion, and ethical judgment. By nightfall, the ship continued its course, the waves calmer, but the air still tense with awareness. Thomas, now seated in the aft deck area under close watch, realized that the lessons he had learned from Friedrich extended beyond navigation and survival. They encompassed moral judgment, the complexities of leadership, and the necessity of trust between rescuer and rescued. The bond forged in survival had been tested once again, and both men had demonstrated that courage, skill, and humanity could endure even when the enemy drew near, and the sea offered no mercy. The Atlantic was deceptively calm that morning, its surface smooth under the pale light of the rising sun. After days of storms, evasions, and tense navigation, the German patrol ship moved steadily, yet every sailor aboard knew that the ocean could shift without warning. Captain Friedrich Weber stood on the bridge, eyes scanning the horizon and the instrumentation, his mind simultaneously calculating course, monitoring potential threats, and reflecting on the moral burden he carried. The decisions of the past days, the rescue of Thomas Harding, the management of storms, and the evasion of enemy vessels, had culminated in this fragile moment of relative safety. Thomas, now physically recovered but still wary, stood near the aft deck, observing the captain's steady demeanor. The lessons of survival, discretion, and resilience were etched deeply in his mind. He had been rescued from near death by the same man whose duty, according to orders and protocol, might have demanded otherwise. The realization weighed heavily. His survival was intertwined with the judgment and courage of a man who had chosen humanity over strict allegiance. The bond between them had grown through shared adversity, quiet instruction, and unspoken acknowledgement of mutual respect. The morning passed with routine drills and maintenance, yet the tension remained beneath the surface. Friedrich addressed the crew calmly, assigning responsibilities and ensuring that watchmen remained vigilant. He provided subtle guidance to Thomas, emphasizing the importance of observation, discretion, and following protocol without drawing attention. The young sailor carried out his duties with precision, understanding that the smallest lapse could compromise their fragile position. Each action reinforced the lessons learned from storms, shipwrecks, and encounters with enemy vessels. Survival required skill, awareness, and trust in those who guided you. As afternoon approached, Friedrich received updated intelligence from Kriegsmarine Command. Allied reconnaissance had shifted westward, moving away from the ship's current position. The immediate threat of detection was reduced, yet the captain remained cautious. He recognized that while opportunity for safer passage existed, complacency could be fatal. The lessons of the Atlantic were unforgiving. Even moments of apparent calm demanded discipline, vigilance, and foresight. Friedrich conveyed these instructions quietly to his officers, maintaining the balance between operational security and ethical responsibility for Thomas's welfare. Thomas, observing the captain's careful management, felt a deep sense of gratitude and understanding. Survival was not merely a product of endurance, it was shaped by judgment, leadership, and moral courage. Friedrich had demonstrated that decisiveness and ethical consideration were not mutually exclusive, but essential components of responsible command. The young sailor reflected on the past days, the shipwreck, the storm, the intelligence threats, and the continuous vigilance required to navigate the Atlantic safely. Each challenge had tested his body, mind, and character, revealing a resilience he had not fully appreciated before. Late in the afternoon, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Friedrich convened a quiet meeting with his officers. He discussed the patrol route, the reduced risk of enemy detection, and the importance of maintaining discipline while continuing toward their mission objectives. His instructions included contingency plans should reconnaissance return unexpectedly. The officers executed his directives with precision, reassured by the captain's calm authority and clear reasoning. For Thomas, witnessing this coordination reinforced the depth of responsibility and skill required to command a ship in wartime conditions. As night fell, the Atlantic became a dark expanse dotted with stars. The ship moved steadily, maintaining course with minimal risk. Thomas remained on deck under supervision, reflecting on the sequence of events that had brought him from near death to relative safety. He recognized that each day had presented physical challenges, moral dilemmas, and strategic decisions, all navigated with the guidance of a captain who valued both life and duty. The bond formed through shared survival was profound, rooted in mutual recognition of courage, judgment, and humanity. Friedrich, standing alone on the bridge for a moment, considered the broader implications of his actions. Saving Thomas had been a moral choice, one that introduced risk, yet it had not endangered the mission thanks to careful planning, vigilance, and the skill of the crew. The captain understood that leadership required balancing duty with ethical responsibility, and that true command was tested in moments when decisions could endanger lives or challenge personal principles. Thomas's survival was proof that courage, discipline, and moral clarity could coexist in the harshest environments. In the quiet hours before midnight, the ship continued its journey across the Atlantic. Thomas, seated near the aft railing, gazed at the dark waters reflecting the starlight. He felt an overwhelming sense of relief and understanding. The Atlantic had tested him repeatedly, each encounter refining his perception of survival, leadership, and human connection. He understood that his rescue, his recovery, and the successful navigation of threats had been achieved through the intersection of skill, discipline, and compassion. The experience had left an indelible mark, shaping not only his understanding of war, but also his appreciation for the complexities of human character. By dawn, the German patrol ship had reached a safer course, distant from enemy search patterns and storms. The crew continued their duties with disciplined precision, yet a quiet sense of accomplishment pervaded the vessel. Thomas, now fully integrated into supervised activities, reflected on the improbable journey. Rescued from death by an enemy captain, trained under his guidance, and shielded from danger while navigating the treacherous Atlantic. The bond forged through adversity and survival was unspoken but enduring, a testament to the strength of human resolve and ethical judgment even amid the chaos of war. Captain Friedrich Weber, observing the calm waters and the recovery of his ship and crew, allowed himself a brief sense of satisfaction. He had upheld his duty, preserved life, and guided his men through danger without compromise to principle. Thomas Harding, standing nearby, recognized the magnitude of this leadership: courage tempered by morality, authority exercised with empathy, and survival achieved through skill and judgment. The Atlantic, vast and indifferent, had tested them both. But in its crucible, humanity, respect, and resilience had endured. The war remained far from over, but for this moment, survival had prevailed, and the lessons learned would resonate for the remainder of their lives.